The night Victoria Hale's car died on Route 9, 43 vehicles passed her before mine did. I know the number because she told me later, flat and exact, the way she told everyone everything. 43 cars, 2 trucks, and 1 county sheriff who slowed down, looked at her heels and her blazer, and decided she probably had a phone and a AAA card, so he kept driving. I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew was there was a woman standing in the headlights of a dead Mercedes on the shoulder of a road that didn't get streetlights past the feed store, and it was almost 11 at night, and my daughter was asleep in the back seat of my truck because her fever had finally broken and I hadn't wanted to leave her home alone with a sitter I couldn't really afford anyway. I want to be clear that I almost didn't stop either. I was tired in the kind of way that lives in your shoulders. I'd spent the day under 2 different transmissions and the evening in an urgent care waiting room, and I had exactly $11 in my account until Friday. Stopping for a stranger on a dark road wasn't smart. It also wasn't a decision, not really. My foot came off the gas before my brain finished the sentence. I pulled onto the shoulder behind her car and left my hazards blinking. Sophie stirred in the back seat, murmured something about pancakes, and went still again. I got out slow, hands where she could see them, because a woman alone at night doesn't need a strange man walking up on her fast. "You need help?" I called out. She turned around like she'd been waiting to be disappointed by the answer. "That depends on whether you're going to charge me $1,000 to look at an engine you don't understand." I almost laughed. Almost. "I'm a diesel mechanic, ma'am. I understand engines fine. I just don't have a tow truck on me tonight." She studied me for a second too long, the way people do when they're deciding whether you're a threat or an inconvenience. Dark coat, city shoes already ruined by gravel, hair that had probably looked perfect 8 hours ago and now had one piece stuck to her jaw from the wind. She looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the car. "It just stopped," she said. "No warning lights. No sound. It just stopped." I popped the hood without asking and she didn't stop me, which told me she'd already run out of better ideas. I checked the obvious things first, because the obvious things are usually the answer and people who drive expensive cars forget that. Battery terminal had corroded loose enough to lose contact on a bump. 15-minute fix if I'd had the right wrench, which I did, because I keep a full set behind the driver's seat out of habit. "You carry tools in your truck," she said, watching me work. "I carry tools everywhere. Man never knows when he's going to need one." That's either very responsible or very sad. "Can be both," I said, and that got the first real look out of her, not measuring me anymore, just looking. I cleaned the terminal, tightened it back down, and told her to try the key. The engine caught on the first turn, and something in her shoulders came down about 2 inches, like she'd been holding a weight she hadn't mentioned. "How much do I owe you?" she said, already reaching for a bag that probably had a checkbook thick enough to buy my truck twice. "Nothing. It's a wrench and 10 minutes. That's not how the world works." "Maybe not your world," I said. I didn't mean it unkind. It just came out plain, the way things do when I'm too tired to filter them. She looked at me like I'd said something in a foreign language. Then she looked past me at my truck, at the small shape of Sophie asleep against the window, at the dented tailgate and the toolbox bungee corded shut because the latch had rusted through 2 winters ago. "Long night for you too," she said. "Long year," I said, and shut the hood. "You're good to go. Get that terminal cleaned properly this week, or it'll happen again somewhere less friendly." Before she got back in the car, she stood there a second longer than the moment needed, looking at me like she was trying to solve something that didn't have a clean answer. "Can I ask you something strange?" she said. "Sure. Why did you actually stop? 40-some cars passed me tonight. I counted. You're the first one who didn't slow down to look and then speed back up." I thought about lying, saying something easy about being raised right or having good parents, and instead I just told her the truth. Because somebody stopping for you shouldn't depend on what you're wearing or what your car costs. If that's the rule people are running on tonight, then somebody's got to break it. She didn't say anything back right away. She just nodded once, like she was filing the sentence away somewhere she intended to return to later, and got in her car. She thanked me twice, which felt like once more than she was used to saying it, and then she drove off into the dark toward whatever life a woman like that went home to. I didn't think I'd see her again. I got back in my truck, checked Sophie's forehead one more time out of habit, and drove home telling myself it was just a good deed on a bad week, nothing more. I was wrong about that, but I wouldn't understand how wrong for another 11 days. My name is Wade Coleman. I'm 36, I fix trucks for a living at a shop outside Millbrook that mostly survives on fleet contracts and stubbornness, and I've raised my daughter Sophie alone since her mother decided that motherhood didn't fit the life she wanted anymore. That's the short version. The long version has more anger in it than I like carrying around, so I mostly stick to the short one. Sophie is 7. She likes pancakes, dinosaurs, and asking questions I don't have good answers for, like why some kids at school have 2 houses and 2 Christmases and she only has one of each. I do my best. Some weeks my best is thin, but it's real, and I've decided real matters more than thin doesn't. 11 days after the roadside night, a black SUV pulled into the shop lot around closing time, and Victoria Hale got out of it wearing jeans instead of a blazer, which somehow made her look more out of place, not less. "You're hard to track down," she said. "You don't have a website." "I fix trucks. I don't sell software." That got a small smile out of her, quick, like she wasn't used to letting one show all the way. "I wanted to pay you properly. For the other night. I told you, it was a wrench in 10 minutes. And I told you that's not how the world works." She held out an envelope. I didn't take it. "Ma'am, if you hand me money for helping a stranger on a dark road, you're going to make me feel like I did it for the money." I didn't. "Keep it." She lowered the envelope slowly, studying me again in that same measuring way, except this time there wasn't anything cold in it. Most people would have taken it without blinking. Most people aren't me. "No," she said quietly. "I'm starting to see that." She didn't leave right away. She stood there in my gravel lot while the shop lights buzzed overhead and asked, almost like she was embarrassed by the question, if I knew anyone reliable who did fence work, because she'd bought a piece of land outside town and the previous owner's fencing was falling apart and every contractor she'd called wanted double what the job was worth once they saw her car. I told her I did fence work on weekends when the shop was slow. She hired me on the spot, cash, no negotiation, and didn't ask a single question about my rate. I should have found that strange. I was too busy doing math about what that money meant for Sophie's winter boots to find it strange. What I didn't know yet, what she didn't tell me for weeks, was that Victoria Hale wasn't just a woman with land and a broken fence. She was the CEO of Hale Freight Solutions, a logistics company her grandfather built and her father nearly ran into the ground, a company with 400 employees and a board of directors that had spent the last 2 years waiting for an excuse to push her out of the chair she'd fought to keep. She didn't tell me because, in her words later, she was tired of being looked at like a spreadsheet with legs. Out here, on a stretch of land with a broken fence and a stranger who fixed things for free, she got to just be Victoria. Not the CEO. Not the granddaughter people whispered didn't deserve the seat. Just a woman standing in a field asking a man with grease on his hands to help her build something that would hold. I worked that fence line every Saturday for a month. Sophie came with me twice, once when the sitter fell through, and Victoria surprised me by not flinching at a 7-year-old underfoot asking 100 questions about why rich people needed so much land if they weren't even keeping cows on it. "I don't know yet what I want it for," Victoria told her, crouched down to Sophie's height, which nobody in a blazer had ever bothered to do around my daughter before. "Sometimes you buy the thing before you know the reason." "That's what my dad says about his tools," Sophie said, dead serious, and Victoria laughed so hard she had to sit down in the grass. That was the day something shifted between us, though neither of us said it out loud. It wasn't romance yet. It was quieter than that. It was the particular kind of trust that grows between 2 people who keep showing up for each other without being asked twice. By the 5th Saturday, I knew her coffee order. She knew Sophie's favorite dinosaur, which was Parasaurolophus, and could pronounce it correctly on the first try, which impressed my daughter more than anything else that woman ever did. Victoria started staying for dinner sometimes, simple food, spaghetti or grilled cheese, nothing that matched whatever she was used to eating in the life I still didn't fully understand. She never once complained. She ate at my chipped kitchen table like it was the finest meal she'd had all week, and maybe it was, because at least at my table nobody was measuring her for weakness. I found out who she really was on a Tuesday, from a newspaper someone left on the counter at the diner. Local business section, a photo of her in a gray suit standing in front of a building with her company's name across the top, the headline asking whether the board would finally force a leadership change at Hale Freight before the end of the quarter. I sat there with my coffee going cold, reading that headline 3 times. I wasn't angry that she hadn't told me. I understood it, actually, better than she probably expected me to. What worried me was the timing, because 2 days later, she called me sounding thinner than I'd heard her sound before, and asked if she could come by. She showed up in her work clothes for the first time since I'd met her, and she looked like a woman who'd been fighting something all day and hadn't won yet. "You could have told me you run a company with 400 people in it," I said, not as an accusation, just laying it out plain. She sat down heavily at my kitchen table. "Would it have changed anything?" "No," I said honestly. "But I'd rather know what I'm standing next to." She looked at her hands. "There's a man on my board named Preston Vance. He was my father's friend before he was anyone's enemy. He thinks the company needs, in his words, a steadier hand at the top. He's been building a case for months that I'm distracted, unfocused, unfit to lead through the next merger cycle. He needs the board to vote no confidence by the end of the quarter, and he's 3 votes short, and every week I spend out here instead of in that building gives him one more argument. Then why do you keep coming out here?" She looked up at me, and for the first time since I'd met her, she didn't have an answer ready. "Because out here, I remember who I was before I became a decision everyone else got to weigh in on." I didn't say anything smooth back. I never do. I just refilled her coffee and let her sit in my kitchen until the silence stopped feeling heavy. Preston Vance showed up at the fence line himself 2 weeks later, which told me he'd been watching closer than either of us realized. He arrived in a car that cost more than my house, wearing a coat that had never once touched a barn, and looked at me the way men like that look at men like me, which is to say, like furniture that had wandered somewhere it didn't belong. "You must be the mechanic," he said, before I'd said a word. "Wade Coleman." "Preston Vance. I sit on the board of Hale Freight Solutions." He said it like a title that should have made me nervous. It didn't. "I'll be direct, Mr. Coleman. Victoria has had a difficult year, and I understand the appeal of, let's call it a simpler distraction. But this," he gestured at the fence, the field, me, like it was all one unfortunate hobby, "is not sustainable for a woman in her position. The board needs to see focus. Instead, they're hearing rumors about a mechanic with a child." Victoria came around the side of the barn just in time to hear that last part, and I watched her face go from surprise to something a lot harder in about 2 seconds. "You drove out here to insult him," she said. "I drove out here to warn you," Preston said. "The vote is in 3 weeks. If the board sees a CEO who spent her spring fixing fences with a man who fixes trucks for a living, that vote will not go your way. I am trying to save your seat, Victoria, whether you thank me for it or not." "My seat isn't yours to save," Victoria said, and her voice had a steadiness in it I hadn't heard before, something forged rather than found. "And Wade is not a distraction. He is the first person in 2 years who has treated me like a person instead of a problem to be managed." Preston looked at me one more time, and I saw the moment he decided I wasn't worth further conversation. He looked instead at Victoria, softer than before, in the way men soften their voice right before they say something meant to cut deeper than shouting ever could. "Your father built that company out of nothing," he said. "He'd want it protected. Not risked on a man you met on the side of a road because you felt lonely." "My father," Victoria said, and her voice didn't rise at all, which somehow made it land harder, "spent the last 10 years of his life letting men like you tell him what the company needed instead of trusting his own instincts, and it nearly ran the business into the ground. I'm not making that mistake twice." Preston's jaw tightened. "Then I hope the fence holds better than the board's patience," he said, and walked back to his car. I stood there with a post-hole digger in my hand, watching him drive off, and Victoria let out a long breath beside me. "He's not wrong that the vote matters," she said quietly. "No," I agreed. "But he's wrong about what's a distraction and what isn't." She looked at me then, really looked, the way she had that first night on the roadside when she stopped measuring me and started seeing me. "You could walk away from this. From the gossip, the board, all of it. Nobody would blame you." "I don't walk away from things because they got complicated," I said. "I walk away from things that aren't worth the trouble. This isn't that." That was the first time she kissed me, standing in a half-finished fence line with dirt on both our hands, and it didn't feel like a distraction to either of us. It felt like the first honest thing either of us had done in a long time. Neither of us talked about it much that first week. We didn't need to. She kept coming out on Saturdays, and I kept finding reasons to stretch the fence work into Sundays too, and somewhere in there we stopped pretending the reason we kept showing up was the fence. The second time she stayed for dinner after that, she brought her own contribution for once, a bottle of wine that probably cost more than my truck payment, and stood in my kitchen looking almost sheepish about it, like she wasn't sure the gesture would land right in a house that measured its groceries by the week instead of the month. "You didn't have to," I said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to bring something that was mine instead of something that was only useful." I didn't have wine glasses that matched, so we drank it out of 2 different jelly jars, and she laughed harder at that than I expected a woman like her to laugh at anything, and Sophie asked if she could have a sip and got a very serious no from both of us at the same time, which made Victoria laugh again. "You two just did that in sync," Sophie said, unimpressed. "That's what married people do on TV." Victoria went quiet for a second, and I felt my ears go warm, and neither of us corrected her. There was a night not long after that when Sophie's mother called out of nowhere, the first time in 8 months, asking if she could see Sophie sometime soon, her voice thin over the phone in a way that told me whatever life she'd built with the man and his motorcycles hadn't turned out the way she'd hoped. I sat on my back steps after that call for a long time, not sure what I felt, and Victoria drove out unannounced an hour later because I hadn't answered her text and she'd gotten worried. "You don't have to fix this one," I told her, when she asked what was wrong. "I'm not trying to fix it," she said, sitting down on the step beside me, close enough that our shoulders touched. "I'm just not going to let you sit out here alone with it." I told her about the call, about the 8 months of silence before it, about the particular ache of loving your daughter enough to want her to have a mother and still being angry at the woman who'd walked away from being one. Victoria listened without trying to hand me an answer, which is rarer in people than it should be, and when I finally ran out of words she just said, "Whatever you decide, Sophie will be fine, because she has you, and you don't leave." "How do you know that?" "Because you didn't leave a stranded car on a dark road," she said. "Some things about a person don't change depending on the size of the problem." I let Sophie's mother come for a short supervised visit 2 weeks later, careful and a little stiff, and it went about as well as those things go, which is to say it didn't fix anything but it didn't break anything either. Victoria never once tried to insert herself into that decision. She just stood beside it, close enough to matter, far enough to let it stay mine. Millbrook found out within a week, the way small towns always do. I heard about it first from the guys at the shop, who ribbed me about dating a woman with a private jet, though she'd never once flown one anywhere I'd seen. Then I heard about it from Sophie's teacher, who asked with careful casualness whether Sophie's home life had changed recently, which told me some parent had been talking at pickup. Then I heard about it from my own mother, who called to ask if it was true I was seeing that Hale woman before she'd even said hello. "Her name is Victoria," I said. "That's not what I asked." "It's true," I said. "And before you say anything about it being complicated, I already know." My mother went quiet for a second, then said the thing that stuck with me longest. "Your father used to say the measure of a man isn't what he's got. It's whether he stays when staying gets expensive." I didn't have an answer for that except to say I intended to stay. The diner gossip got sharper before it got kinder, the way it usually does in a town small enough that everyone knows whose truck is parked where. I went in for coffee one morning and heard 2 women at the counter, not bothering to lower their voices much, wondering out loud whether the Coleman boy was smart enough to know he was being used, or whether the Hale woman just liked the novelty of a man who worked with his hands before she got bored and went back to whatever men she usually kept company with. I didn't say anything. I ordered my coffee, paid for it, and left, because arguing with gossip is like arguing with weather. It doesn't listen and it doesn't stop, it just runs its course. But Marla, who'd been running that diner counter since before I was born, caught me at the door and pressed a bag of day-old muffins into my hands, free of charge, the closest thing to a public statement she was willing to make. "Don't you let them get in your head, Wade," she said. "I remember your daddy fixing Ed Whitfield's roof for free the winter Ed's wife got sick, and nobody in this town said one kind word about it until Ed's wife pulled through and started saying it for him. People talk loud about what they don't understand and quiet about what they do. Give it time." She was right, mostly. It took time, but it came around the way small towns eventually do, usually once they see enough evidence with their own eyes to make the gossip inconvenient. The turning point, if there was one single moment, came the day Victoria showed up at Sophie's school fundraiser in jeans and old sneakers, running the dunking booth line for 2 hours in the sun, soaked to the bone from 3 different kids' perfect aim, laughing the whole time in a way that had nothing performed about it. By the time she left, half the parents who'd been whispering about her at pickup were asking if she wanted to help organize next year's spring carnival. Victoria's world had its own version of gossip, colder and better dressed, but just as loud in its way. Board members who'd never once asked about her personal life suddenly had opinions about it. An assistant let it slip that Preston had been quietly polling other board members, asking whether a CEO photographed at a small-town diner with a mechanic and his daughter projected the kind of image Hale Freight needed heading into merger talks with a much larger logistics firm. Victoria told me all of this at my kitchen table one night, flipping through printouts of emails her assistant had forwarded her, the same way Tessa once flipped through invoices, except the stakes here weren't hay and cattle. They were 400 jobs and a company with her grandfather's name on the door. I could end this, she said, not looking up. Publicly. I could say we're just friends. It would take the pressure off before the vote. You could, I said. Would it be true? She looked up sharply. No. Then don't say it just because it's convenient. It might save the company, Wade. Might, I said. Or it might just prove Preston right that you'll bend the second the pressure gets heavy. I don't know your boardroom. I know fences. And I know a fence that bends every time the wind picks up isn't a fence. It's decoration. She sat with that for a long moment, then reached across the table and took my hand, grease stains and all. Then I won't bend it. The week before the vote, Victoria barely slept. I'd drive out to see her after closing the shop and find her at her kitchen table surrounded by printed financial reports, dark circles under her eyes, a cold cup of coffee she'd forgotten to drink. One night I found her just sitting there, not reading anything, staring at a framed photo of her grandfather standing in front of the very first Hale Freight truck, a rusted-out flatbed that looked like it belonged in my shop more than in a company history book. He started with one truck, she said, without looking up. One truck in a route nobody else wanted because it ran through towns too small to matter to the bigger carriers. He used to say the company would only be worth keeping if it never forgot what those towns needed. Sounds like a man who'd have liked Millbrook, I said. She smiled, small and tired. He would have liked you. He never trusted a man who didn't know how to work with his hands. I sat down across from her and took the stack of reports out of her grip, gently, and set them aside. You've read every number in that stack 40 times. Reading it a 41st time before the vote isn't going to change what's in it. Come eat something. Then sleep. You'll fight better rested than you will exhausted. She let me make her eggs at 11 at night, the only thing I knew how to cook well without a recipe, and she ate them at her own kitchen table like they were the finest meal in the city, the same way she always did at mine, and for a little while the fear in her shoulders eased enough that she actually slept that night, curled against me on a couch too small for both of us, and neither of us complained about the size of it once. The vote came 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning, and Victoria asked me to be there. Not in the boardroom, she said, that would only give Preston more ammunition, but outside it, in the lobby, so she'd know exactly where to find steady ground if the floor dropped out from under her. I wore my one good shirt, the same one with the stubborn grease mark near the cuff that never quite came out no matter how many times I scrubbed it, because some things about a man don't wash away and I'd stopped being ashamed of that a long time ago. Sophie stayed with my mother that morning, which was its own kind of vote of confidence, since my mother didn't hand over babysitting duty for anything less than serious business. The lobby of Hale Freight Solutions had marble floors and a wall of glass looking out over the city, and I felt every bit the mechanic standing in it, boots too heavy on floors too shiny, but I didn't leave. I sat on a bench near the elevators and waited the way I'd waited in urgent care rooms and courtrooms and every other place where the outcome mattered more than my comfort. Preston Vance walked past me twice before the vote, both times slowing just enough to make sure I saw him seeing me, like a man reminding a stray dog where the property line was. I didn't give him the reaction he wanted. I just nodded and let him walk on. The vote took 40 minutes. I know because I watched the second hand on the lobby clock go around it exactly 40 times, thinking about Sophie's dinosaur facts and Victoria's coffee order and whether 400 people I'd never met were about to lose the woman who'd fought harder for their jobs than any of them probably knew. When the boardroom doors finally opened, Victoria came out first, and I couldn't read her face at all, which scared me more than anything Preston had said in 3 weeks. "Well," I said, standing. 4-3, she said. "The board voted to keep me as CEO." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. 4-3 isn't exactly a landslide. "No," she said, and something in her mouth twitched toward a smile. "It's exactly enough." Preston came out behind her, jaw tight, coat buttoned like armor. He looked at me one more time, and this time there was something almost like respect buried under the anger, the way a man looks at an opponent he'd underestimated. "You should know," he said to Victoria, though his eyes stayed on me, "the merger talks will still require a united front. This isn't over." "No," Victoria agreed. "But it's mine to finish now. Not yours." He left without another word, and Victoria turned to me in that marble lobby, in front of assistants and executives who'd spent 3 weeks deciding what kind of woman she was, and she took my hand the same way she had at my kitchen table, grease stains and all, except this time there was nothing to hide and nowhere she needed to hide it. "I almost let him win," she said quietly. "For about 10 minutes in there, I almost said what he wanted me to say, that this was a mistake, that I'd end it, just to buy the votes. I want you to know that." "But you didn't." "No. Because somewhere around minute 11, I thought about you telling me a fence that bends every time the wind picks up isn't a fence. And I decided I'd rather lose the vote standing straight than win it lying down." I didn't have a smooth answer for that either. I just pulled her in and held on, right there in the lobby, in front of everybody who'd spent 3 weeks betting against us. The months after that were not a fairy tale, and I want to be honest about that, because the reference version people expect from a story like this usually skips the ugly parts. There were mornings Victoria had to fly out for meetings I didn't understand, industries and numbers that meant nothing to me, and I stayed home fixing trucks and packing Sophie's lunch and feeling, sometimes, like the two of us were living in different currencies of time. There were mornings I had to work a double shift covering for a guy who called in sick, and Victoria sat through a school recital alone in the 3rd row because I couldn't get off work, and afterward she told me she didn't mind, and I believed her, and some days I still worried it was a lie she was being generous with. But she kept showing up. That was the thing that mattered most, the thing Preston Vance never understood about either of us. She kept driving out to Millbrook on weekends even after the vote was won and there was nothing left to prove to anybody. She kept learning Sophie's dinosaur facts and getting them right on the first try. She kept sitting at my chipped kitchen table eating grilled cheese like it was the finest meal in the city, because by then it wasn't a performance. It was just her life, the one she'd chosen on purpose, the same way Emma once told a man in a bookstore that on purpose mattered more than anything else. The merger Preston had warned about went through 6 months later, bigger and more complicated than either of us had expected. There were weeks Victoria worked past midnight on calls with lawyers in 3 time zones, and weeks I drove Sophie to school in the dark because Victoria had asked me to sit in on a call about warehouse jobs even though I had no business being in that conversation, just so she'd have one voice in the room that wasn't measuring her. There was one bad night in the middle of it, worse than the others, where the larger company's negotiators tried to push through a clause that would have cut nearly 60 positions at the Millbrook distribution hub, the same hub where 2 of my regular customers worked, men I saw every week bringing their trucks in for oil changes and complaining about their knees. Victoria came to my house after the call looking hollowed out in a way I hadn't seen since the night her car died on Route 9. "I could sign it," she said, sitting at my kitchen table without taking her coat off, staring at nothing. "It would close the deal faster. It would make the board happy. It would make Preston's replacement happy. And it would mean 60 families in this town lose their jobs 3 weeks before Christmas." "Then don't sign it," I said. "It's not that simple, Wade. There are numbers, there are shareholders, there's a whole structure that doesn't care what happens to Ed's knees or whether Dale down at the hub can make his mortgage." "Maybe not," I said. "But you care. And you told me once that being seen clearly mattered more to you than winning quietly. So don't lose that now just because the room got bigger." She didn't sleep much that night. Neither did I, honestly, sitting up with her while she rewrote the deal terms twice, then a 3rd time, building a version that protected the hub jobs by trimming corporate overhead instead, a version her own team told her the other side would probably reject outright. They didn't reject it. It took another 11 days of tense calls and one meeting Victoria flew out for on 4 hours of sleep, but the final agreement kept every job at the Millbrook hub, and Victoria told me afterward that it was the first deal in her career she was actually proud to put her name on, not because it was the biggest number she'd ever signed, but because it was the first one where she hadn't had to choose between being effective and being decent. Victoria came out the other side of all of it tired but standing, her grandfather's name still on the door, 400 jobs still 400 jobs, 60 of them in Millbrook still exactly where they'd been before Preston Vance ever tried to use them as a bargaining chip. She told me once, late at night, that the version of her that survived that merger wasn't the version Preston had spent 2 years trying to push out. It was a better one. Steadier. Harder to knock down, because she'd finally stopped trying to be steady and hard to knock down all by herself. Preston resigned from the board 18 months later, quietly, without much fuss, taking a position at a rival firm that Victoria said with a small private smile was exactly the kind of company that deserved him. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. Some victories are better left unexamined, the way you don't poke too hard at a fence post once it's finally holding. Sophie started calling Victoria by her first name without anyone asking her to, somewhere around month 4, and by month 10 she'd started asking, with the blunt honesty only a 7-year-old can manage, when Victoria was going to just live here instead of driving back and forth all the time. Victoria laughed the first time Sophie asked, and then she looked at me over my daughter's head with an expression that wasn't a joke at all. 2 years after the night her car died on Route 9, I asked Victoria to marry me at that same stretch of fence line, the one we'd built together board by board on quiet Saturdays while a company and a board of directors argued over what she was worth. I'd kept one section of that fence unpainted on purpose, a plain gray board standing out against the rest, and when she noticed it and asked why, I told her some things are worth leaving visible so you remember exactly what held when the wind picked up. She said yes before I even finished getting the ring out of my pocket, which she still teases me about, saying I ruined the moment by fumbling. I tell her I didn't ruin anything. I just wanted her to know the answer mattered more to me than the performance of asking. We got married that fall in a field, not a ballroom, because Victoria said she'd spent enough of her life inside buildings with marble floors and wanted, for once, to promise something out in the open where the wind could hear it too. Preston wasn't invited. 43 cars that once drove past a stranded woman on a dark road weren't invited either, though none of them knew it. My mother cried through the whole thing. Sophie was the flower girl and took the job so seriously she nearly tackled a groomsman who stepped on the aisle runner wrong. People still ask us sometimes how we met, expecting some story about galas or introductions through mutual friends, because that's the story people expect from a woman who runs a company with 400 employees. Victoria always tells them the truth. She says a poor single dad stopped on a dark road when 43 other cars didn't, and fixed something that was broken without asking what it would cost him. I usually add the rest. I tell them I didn't stop because I knew who she was. I stopped because somebody needed help, and that used to be reason enough for people to pull over, and I decided it still should be. Neither of us has ever needed to say more than that, because the two answers together are the whole truth, the same way a fence only holds when every post agrees to carry its own share of the weight. What would you have done if you passed a stranded stranger on a dark road at 11 at night, tired, broke, with your kid asleep in the back seat? Would you have kept driving like the other 43 cars, or would you have pulled over the way Wade did? And have you ever had someone see past what you had, straight through to what you were actually worth? Tell me your story in the comments below. If this one hit you the way it hit me while I wrote it, leave a like, subscribe for more stories like this one, and I'll see you in the next video.